I don't have slides per se. I think I have a couple of visuals that I'll use in my discussion. My name is Stephanie Smith. I'm the clinical nurse manager of research at the Lewis Cancer and Research Pavilion in Savannah, Georgia. We are part of the Georgia NCORR. We are a decentralized NCORR, so we manage our own clinical research program, the trials we open, and the way in which we conduct them individually at each institution within our NCORR. So I hope my talk is helpful if you're with a centralized NCORR or a large institution that has information and IRB approvals that kind of come down from like a lead site. You maybe can still apply some elements of my talk to your site if any of what I'm about to talk about has happened at your institution. But what I'm going to talk about is issues associated with patient notification or reconsent, because as we know, consent, informed consent is always ongoing. It's rarely just obtained once in the beginning. Sometimes, for some trials, it might be the case, but often with these treatment trials, there's different things that come up through the life of the study that requires the patient to be notified in some form or fashion. So after being cited in an audit for failure to reconsent the patient appropriately for this particular trial, I decided to kind of look at the process in which amendments were distributed to the clinical research coordinators and maybe try to find that loophole where that process failed us and this patient wasn't reconsented appropriately. So the way in which we previously used to distribute documents, the regulatory coordinator would prepare the entire packet, a beautiful packet with everything. Of course, the new consent and the new protocol, but also the change memo, the IRB approval letter, action letters, anything that was associated with that protocol amendment. And she would leave it on the responsible coordinator's desk. So when kind of looking at what happened with this particular patient, and it's not that the coordinators aren't knowledgeable about or able to read the documents to understand what was in them. I think just in the kind of the busy hustle and bustle, what happens sometimes is the old consent is replaced with a new consent, the old protocol is replaced with a new protocol and filed, and not necessarily looked, thoroughly at all of the documents to determine if patient notification is required. So I think that's what happened in this particular case. So we tweaked that a little bit, and now the regulatory coordinator brings all of the amendments to me, regardless of what they are. And I review the documents to see if patient notification is required. And if it is, then I attach a bright orange sheet. Do you have that visual? Yeah, okay. So it's an alert, it stands out, patient notification required, and then I'll fill it out appropriately. I check the appropriate boxes and attach it right on the top of that packet. Next slide is also an example of a patient notification log that I developed. So it includes the study name, the amendment or revision number, and then the method of patient notification filled in there, and then that's also attached to the packet. The responsible coordinator, I never leave them on the desk anymore. I hand them off, and we have a discussion about what the patient notification entails. As you all probably know, there's multiple methods in which patients might be notified. Maybe a patient letter, a dear patient letter, maybe a consent addendum, which I love those, and I think SWOG's the only one that's really doing those right now, but I think they're fantastic. Formal reconsent or even a verbal notification with the patient. One thing to keep in mind is that one particular study might have a reconsent required for a certain group of patients and maybe a verbal notification with another. So the method of notification might vary amongst the participants on that study. So keep in mind with that, that can occur. I recall a DART study, patient notification, where the patients on treatment had to be reconsented, but patients who were in follow-up, no longer receiving the Nevo, still had to be verbally notified, and by telephone was acceptable. And I think that was the first time I can recall, even in recent memory, of calling patients that had been off treatment for a few months to talk about this unanticipated problem. So it kind of depends on the the reason for the patient notification, the reason for the amendment that kind of drives the method of notification. Also, there's been an FDA registration trial, one of the Alchemist sub-studies, Anvil, that even required a patient letter for the patients on observation. So it's not always the patients on active treatment that require notification. And so, of course, it's often, easily missed when it's an observation patient. So again, you would have variations in the type of notification depending on what group the patient's in. Sometimes there's Arm A versus Arm B, so patients on drug X need to be notified or reconsented, but the patients on drug Y don't. So you just kind of have to look through that and determine what's required for which patients. And also, I've found that different sponsors utilize different things. Some sponsors really use those patient letters a lot, and some don't. I'm not really sure why that is the case, but you just have to always, of course, follow what the sponsor requires for patient notification. Just make sure there was anything else I wanted to say about that. And I will say that in our recent audit, we had a very large NRG audit just a couple of months ago. We had, I believe, 17 cases from my institution audited, and we didn't have a single one cited for informed consent from our institution. So I think that the method is probably working pretty well for us. There's always, of course, that element of human error when you're doing clinical trials. These things might still occur. But one thing that I've found as a manager and, of course, previously a clinical research coordinator is that it's really important to round or huddle with your team, get to know the patients that are on the trials, not necessarily to say that you go and you meet these patients yourself, but just kind of have an idea of how many patients the coordinator has on a particular study, which groups they're in, so that when if you do implement something like what we've decided to do at my institution, you can have a real back and forth conversation with that coordinator. Like I often go to Cheryl, she's in the audience, and I know she has a patient on, two patients on a melanoma study, and they're on different treatments. So sometimes it's patient notification for dabrafenib or trametinib or Ipi-Nivo, and so we can kind of have a discussion like, oh yeah, she's coming, you need to reconsent her or notify her. And again, documentation, you've got to document that this occurred in the patient's chart, especially if it's a verbal discussion with the patient. Of course, if you have a formal reconsent done, that will be in the chart and your consent note going along with that. But the verbal discussions really have to, you got to make sure you document those, or you would still be cited in an audit for that. And that's all I have about our real life scenario at my institution.
I did fail to say at the beginning that if you have a story that may be similar to theirs or something totally different, at this time we would like to have those shared moments so that others in the audience could relate or may relate to what issues you had and how you resolved them. So first of all, I'd like to ask if anyone has any questions of them about their scenarios. And if so, please come to the microphone, and then we'll go on with any shared stories that someone would like to get up and tell us about.
Hello, my name is Zava and I'm from Loyola University, Chicago. I would like to, I don't really have a question. Those are common mistakes, and it have happened sometimes at my site as well, and we were trying to improve that. What I would like to add is we all have to keep in mind, we don't determine how the patient will be notified. That comes with the amendment.
Correct.
So we have to pay close attention what's directed, because study chair, FDA, they are the ones who decide and instruct how patient to be informed. Is it verbal? If it's verbal as well as if it's verbal, of course it must be documented that patient was informed, how was informed, what was discussed, all the details, because auditors are asking for it. I don't know, because I had feeling that you said you decide how to inform the patient, or maybe I misunderstood.
No, I don't decide. Like you said, this it's determined by the sponsor, but the method might be different for different patients on the same study, depending on where the patient is in their treatment, their course of treatment. So,
And I think those are, regard to this, there are specific, that's specific information also provided by the amendments
Correct.
that are coming. For action letters, I know for sure that we should not wait even for IRB submission or approval, but patient must be informed immediately.
correct, and that's always included in the change memo and the central IRB application. So I'll review all of those, and then when I take it to the research coordinator, we review what needs to be done. If it's by the patient's next visit, then of course, the coordinator will ensure that she has that discussion with the patient or reconsent at the next visit. Or if it's an unanticipated problem and the patient notification is required immediately, even prior to their next visit, then that occurs too. And then it's documented on the log. It just depends. I use Darton as an example because there was reconsent required for the patients on Nevo. Of course, that was decided by the sponsor. But the patients off of Nevo in follow-up still had to be notified even by telephone, and that was the language in the change memo that was acceptable. And at my institution, we actually had 2 patients that were referred to our site to participate in DART, but they weren't previously patients at our cancer center. So they were no longer coming to our cancer center. They both lived in South Carolina, and we are in Georgia. So that was the first time I can even recall ever, even being advised by the sponsor that telephone notification for patients and follow-up off treatment was required and had to be done, which was great in the instance of mine because those patients were no longer coming to our cancer center anymore.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Stephanie, is my manager, and she's from my institution. To elaborate a little bit more, we have a situation where although CIRB has approved changes, there are still having to go to our local IRB, some of these cases. So we had to make a plan on how each of us would understand which ones had to go to local before we made the reconsented. Would you like to share a little bit of that?
Sure. There was a study recently that was previously, it was open several years ago before we began using the central IRB. I believe we even had it open before we were an NCORE institution. But it was a local IRB study. And the patient notification statement was that it was up to the local IRB to determine the risk to the patient, the relative risk, and if reconsent was required. And our local IRB just sent back an approval letter without advising the one patient we have that is like 5 years out from treatment if he needed to be notified of some new IPI risks. There was some confusion about that because the sponsor said it was up to the IRB of record to determine risk to each patient, and our IRB didn't ask for that, like how long was this patient on study, when did they go off. So we had to go back to the local IRB and get clarification on what they wanted us to do. Did they want us to notify this patient? And ultimately, it came back that they did. He only comes in once a year, so we'll give him a phone call. This is something that just occurred probably last week or the week before. Old melanoma study.
We had a similar situation where happened something similar, so I will not repeat the same thing. However, I think after what happened, we realized that the person who was submitting the information to IRB did not specify the specific information from the sponsor, because even IRB, to make a decision, right decision, have to have the right information provided. Whoever submitted did not provide all the information, so of course IRB didn't make the right decision. So I think still it's up to somebody who submit the amendment.
Well, I think our local IRB hasn't really been approving these amendments and these patient notification. A lot of these types of things have been in recent years, since our IRB has really been having to approve such documents. So I don't know that they thoroughly looked at it. I can't speak for our local IRB on why they didn't advise back what was required or what they wanted us to do. But it does seem like it's been more in recent years that there have been maybe a more common requirement, if you will, to notify patients. I've been doing this for about 10 years now, and I don't recall 6 years ago having so many variations of patient notification or patients in follow-up, patients in observation. And the one I spoke of is an FDA registration trial, so I don't know if that has to do with it. But the take-home from this is, to really ensure that you review those IRB-approved documents and change memo, central IRB application on what is required for patient notification.
Back when all of us were with our local IRBs, we had this national variation on whatever the amendment was and the reconsent. Some people would say this, because there were variations of all these local IRBs. But the one standard of our local IRBs, again, this is pre-CIRB even coming into existence, was that the IRB rules. End of story. A sponsor could come in and say, the IRB letter ruled. We are using language in here talking about we taking our guidance from our sponsors. The IRB of record is the CIRB, and just like in the local IRB, their decision rules. Above sponsor, above Genentech, above. And one of the problems that anybody who processes regulatory documents now knows is we are referenced in the IRB letter to a sponsor application. We should really be blinded to any sponsor application. If you run a Genentech study, you have no idea what Genentech is sending WERB. You never see it. You'll never see it. If you wanted it, you wouldn't even be able to get it. So we have been pushing, myself and others in QA and across the country and some of our auditors, in really trying to ask the CIRB in their approval letter to not punt us to an application. This is not an anti-SWOG, anti-sponsor. We've been relying and partnering with our sponsors forever. They are not our IRB of record. And so we really need the information in our IRB letters. And I've noticed of late that in a couple of studies, they'll put it in the letter, just all of a sudden.
Yeah.
And that's not very often. And what happens is, based on how that is filled out in the application, basis on how clear it is in the instruction of what we're supposed to do.
Right.
Now, in looking at the application, they're pretty good about follow-up, I like the question
Right.
format, even though I shouldn't be seeing it.
I agree.
But the other piece of this is what you mentioned about observation patients. Once you step into the long-term follow-up category of patients, which is all they break it down to, they don't say 3 years post-treatment. They don't say 3 months post-treatment. It's a long-term follow-up patient. My institution with 20 sites does every patient that's ever signed a consent. One critical element in the consent says, we have a duty to keep you informed of changes with this protocol. If you were never on that drug, it is still a change to the study at the time they consented, or fill in the blank, whatever it is. So long-term follow-up patients, we don't get into, oh, they were observation only, it doesn't mean that. Because it is left up quasi to interpretation if all the box check says all participants. That means anybody who signed consent. So I always remind my team, remember the duty of consenting says, part of it is we will keep you informed of any changes irrespective of arm, irrespective of treatment, irrespective of anything. Our local IRB, back before we were with the CIRB, always was over-informed versus under-informed. They will never be sensing that they weren't informed if you over-inform, and yes, of course you say you weren't on Nevo, so this doesn't affect you, but we are informing you out of the duty that was signed in your consent. And if you haven't noticed, I have strong feelings about this. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing. Are there any other questions?
Hi, I'm from Northwestern, so we have a large site and lots of other sites that also use our consent forms, and we're also trying to combat this issue of reconsent. I like the idea of you, as a manager, taking responsibility, but I was just wondering what the logistics are and how sustainable that is for you, and if you have run into any issues, if it needs to cross your desk and a consent was maybe approved in the morning, are we missing that? Like, how does that work? Are coordinators reaching out to you first? Just kind of more information of how that works.
Yeah,
in the
no, they're
office.
not really reaching out to me first because the regulatory coordinator will bring me the amendment, and then I'll review it, and then I'll take it to the coordinator. Can't recall an instance in which the patient may have just been in and then a consent addendum or a reconsent came required, but, and it would still occur, just document that the patient was in prior to, and the consent would be obtained at the next visit, and then document that at the consent time. And then on that log that we use, that log gets filed in the regulatory binder with the rest of the amendment documents for reference.
What's your turnaround time from when the regulatory coordinator gives you the amendment to the coordinator?
Same day, usually.
Same day.
If I know that it's a replacement, we have no patients on a study and that coordinator isn't there, then I'll wait. Every once in a while, we have all of the match sub-studies still open in the event that we have a patient who can go on one of those, but we have no patients now, so sometimes I will leave the match amendment with the coordinator and just leave that, don't hand it off. But if patient notification is required, I always hand it off, and we talk about it. So immediately, if I look and see it's an action letter, patient notification required, pretty urgent thing, then I go right away. We are a smaller institution, but we do pretty well with our enrollments. I have 6 nurses and 2 non-nurse coordinators. We have a site in South Carolina. So we have to send those documents to South Carolina. But our NCI trial enrollment isn't super high in South Carolina, so it kind of eliminates that barrier a little bit because there aren't really a lot of participants out there.
Yeah, and I like your setup. I'm glad that you shared that because although we're larger, we still break it up by operations managers and coordinators, so it might be something
Yeah.
that we could also
Yeah, you can
implement.
probably still maybe apply
Yeah.
little bits of that, or have maybe a team lead or something that kind of reviews and distributes. I know that a lot of the larger institution, you might have breast team, lung team, and that sort of thing.
Absolutely.
And so maybe have those conversations there and ensure that you have, just implement a process for your institution. I do some auditing for another research base, and just about every time I go out for an audit, there's at least one major for failure to reconsent or notify the patient. So it's not just a thing that happened at my institution, it happens at almost all that I go to.
Absolutely, and I
Yeah.
think it's a novel idea to take it away from the coordinator and the regulatory coordinator and take some oversight of that.
Yeah,
It's great.
Yeah, because I mean, I've seen it happen with novice nurses, seasoned nurses. It just
Their
happens
workload.
to everyone when you're busy and you get an amendment and you tend to just refile it, swap it out, and not, not in a negligent manner, but just miss it. It just gets missed.
Thank you.
If there's no more questions, I just wanted to plug one more thing. I support S1714, which is the predictive taxane-induced peripheral neuropathy trial. Krista and I are going to be checking people off tomorrow at 4. So if you're interested in opening that trial, or you're opening it at your institution, come and see us. We'll check you off.
Thank you.